The first person to notice the house had changed was the postman. For nearly 30 years, he had cycled past the weatherboard cottage at the top of Jacaranda Hill. The paint had faded from cream to gray, the roses had grown wild, the lace curtains had yellowed until they looked as though they belonged to another century. The owner, Margaret O'Sullivan, had become part of the scenery. She was one of those women people described kindly as private, though what they usually meant was lonely. She waved politely. She paid her rates on time. She attended church every second Sunday, and she had not spoken more than 20 words to any neighbor in years. Then one Monday morning, the curtains were open. Fresh flowers sat in every window. Music drifted through the garden. The postman stopped his bicycle. "Well," he muttered, "I'll be." Nobody knew why Margaret had changed. Some guessed illness. Others whispered she'd won the lottery. Mrs. Brennan across the road announced confidently that there was surely a man involved. "There always is," she told anyone prepared to listen. She had been widowed 21 years, but still believed every story eventually came down to romance. Sometimes she was right. Sometimes life surprised her. Margaret herself would have laughed if anyone had asked. There wasn't a man. Not yet. There was simply a letter. It had arrived 6 weeks earlier. The handwriting had stopped her before she even opened it. Elegant, careful, slightly slanted. Her sister Kathleen's handwriting. Impossible. Kathleen had died 12 years ago. Margaret had stood in the hallway for nearly 10 minutes, unable to breathe. Inside was another envelope. On the front, Kathleen had written, "Open only when you have finally become tired of being lonely." Margaret smiled despite herself. Typical Kathleen. Still organizing everyone from beyond the grave. The letter had been written long before illness claimed her. "My dear Maggie, if you're reading this, then either you've finally admitted you miss people, or someone has tricked you into opening it. Either way, listen carefully. You've spent your whole life believing love is something that can disappear overnight. You're wrong. People disappear. Love doesn't. You have hidden yourself long enough. Open the windows. Plant flowers. Invite people in. You'll think this is ridiculous. Do it anyway. Love, Kath." Margaret had folded the letter carefully. Then she cried harder than she had at the funeral. She had been 27 when everything changed. She had loved only one man, Daniel. He taught history at the local school and played terrible piano every Friday night simply because it amused him. He had proposed beside the river, not with diamonds, not with speeches. Simply by saying, "I don't want another ordinary Tuesday unless you're in it." She had said yes before he'd finished asking. 3 weeks later, his car slid on rain-soaked bitumen. By dawn, he was gone. Half the town attended the funeral. Half the town expected Margaret would recover. She never quite did. Life continued. She simply stopped participating in it. Kathleen had tried everything. Blind dates, dinner parties, volunteer work, choirs, book clubs, even ballroom dancing. Margaret politely declined every suggestion, until eventually even Kathleen gave up trying, or so Margaret had thought. Apparently, she'd simply delayed the conversation by 12 years. The following morning, Margaret opened every window, the house filled with fresh spring air. Dust danced in shafts of sunlight. She realized she had forgotten what birds sounded like indoors. She pruned the roses, bought lavender, painted the front gate herself. Neighbors noticed. Children noticed. Dogs noticed. Life has a curious way of recognizing when someone begins living again. The first visitor arrived accidentally. A young woman stood outside with a crying toddler. "I'm terribly sorry," she said. "My car overheated." Margaret almost apologized and closed the door. Old habits. Instead, she heard Kathleen's voice. "Invite people in." "Come inside." The young mother smiled with obvious relief. Her name was Sophie. The toddler was Oliver. Within 10 minutes, Oliver had discovered Margaret's biscuit tin. Within 20 minutes, he'd decided she was his grandmother. Children often made important decisions quickly. Sophie returned 2 weeks later with homemade banana bread, then again with muffins. Eventually, she stopped pretending she needed excuses. Margaret learned Sophie had moved after a painful divorce. She worked remotely. She knew nobody. "I thought I was the only lonely person on this street." Margaret laughed. "Oh, my dear. Loneliness is much more common than people admit." That sentence stayed with Sophie. Soon she mentioned it to someone else, then someone else. By Christmas, half the street had visited the cottage, not because they needed anything, because someone else had. Friday afternoon tea became tradition. Nobody organized it. Nobody announced it. It simply happened. Mrs. Brennan brought slices. The retired accountant arrived with impossible crossword puzzles. Teenagers wandered in after school. Someone always made tea. Someone always laughed. Someone always stayed longer than intended. The old cottage became the sort of place every neighborhood secretly hopes exists. One rainy Friday, a man arrived carrying a soaked golden retriever. "I'm looking for number 27. "This is 27. "Oh." He looked embarrassed. "I've clearly interrupted something." "You've interrupted absolutely nothing," Margaret replied. "There are too many scones." "There are never too many scones," Mrs. Brennan called from the kitchen. The room erupted in agreement. The man introduced himself as Patrick Flynn, recently retired architect, recently relocated, recently widowed. There was something gentle about him. Not sadness exactly. Recognition. He knew the language lonely people spoke without words. Patrick returned the following Friday, then the next. Eventually, nobody remembered a time before he occupied the armchair beside the fireplace. He repaired loose hinges, built raised garden beds, fixed dripping taps. Not because anyone asked, because useful people often heal themselves by helping others. Margaret watched him quietly. He never flirted, never hurried conversation, never tried to impress. He simply listened, real listening, the sort becoming increasingly rare. One afternoon, he admired Daniel's photograph. "He looks kind." He was. "You still miss him?" "Every day." Patrick nodded. "My wife still makes me laugh." Margaret looked puzzled. He smiled. "I know she's gone. But yesterday I bought the wrong tea because I could hear her saying, 'Patrick, honestly.'" Margaret laughed until tears appeared. Not sad tears. Remembering tears. There is a difference. Spring became summer. Summer slipped gently towards autumn. The jacaranda tree showered purple petals over the front garden. Patrick was sweeping them when Margaret joined him. "They'll only fall again." "I know. Then why sweep them? So we can enjoy them twice." She looked at him. He continued sweeping as though he hadn't said anything remarkable. But he had. Mrs. Brennan observed everything from across the road. She announced confidently, "I give it until Easter." Nobody asked what she meant. She told them anyway. "They're in love. They're 70. And?" Mrs. Brennan folded her arms. "People don't stop needing someone simply because their knees hurt." Margaret disagreed, at least with herself. She insisted Patrick was simply a friend, a wonderful friend, a dependable friend, the best sort. Then one evening he failed to appear for Friday tea. She found herself glancing repeatedly towards the door. Tea tasted flat. Conversation seemed oddly unfinished. That frightened her. The following morning she walked to his cottage. Patrick answered, looking pale. Just a dreadful cold. I brought soup." "You've made soup?" "I bought soup." "That's more believable." He laughed. She realized how much she'd missed hearing it. She stayed 2 hours. Neither noticed. When leaving, she paused at the gate. "I worried. I know. I haven't worried about anyone for a very long time." Patrick nodded slowly. "I've been hoping you might." She walked home beneath autumn leaves, wondering whether hearts really could learn old lessons twice. Weeks later, Patrick produced a small cardboard box. Margaret looked alarmed. "If that's a ring." "It isn't." She relaxed. Inside lay an old brass front door key. "My house." "I know. I wondered." He hesitated. "I don't particularly want to live there anymore." Her smile faded. "I'm not asking you to move." "Oh. I'm asking if you'd like me to move here." She stared. "This house is where everyone gathers. It already feels like home." "I thought perhaps." He shrugged awkwardly. Perhaps home could belong to 2 people. Margaret looked towards the jacaranda tree. Purple blossoms drifted lazily across the lawn. Kathleen had been right. Love hadn't disappeared. It had simply waited patiently until she remembered where she'd left it. She closed Patrick's fingers gently around the key. "No." His face fell. Then she smiled. "We'll keep both houses. You don't have to give up yours. And I don't have to give up mine. We'll simply decide every morning where we'd rather drink tea." Patrick laughed. "I should have known you'd improve the idea." Years later, children who had grown into adults still spoke about the cottage on Jacaranda Hill. It was where arguments became conversations, where strangers became neighbors, where birthdays were celebrated whether you remembered them or not, where nobody knocked loudly because everyone assumed they were welcome. People often believed the place had been special because of its garden, or its old timber floors, or the endless supply of scones. But those who knew better understood the truth. A house does not become a home because someone lives in it. It becomes a home because someone decides that no one who enters should ever feel alone. And on quiet afternoons, when sunlight filtered through the jacaranda branches and laughter drifted from the open windows, Margaret would sometimes catch herself smiling for no reason at all. Then she would remember a letter, written many years before by a sister who understood that grief and hope could live in the same heart. She would silently thank Kathleen. "Pour another cup of tea. Open the front door a little wider." Because somewhere, just beyond the gate, there was almost certainly another lonely soul who had forgotten that the simplest invitation in the world could also be the most life-changing. "Come in," she would say. "The kettle's just boiled." And somehow, it always had.